from a biblical perspective, I just don't see a place for an entheogen. They're just not there.
Welcome to Jesus in the Upper Left, where we're talking about gospel multiplication in the Pacific Northwest. Well, welcome to today's podcast episode. My name is Gabe Kolstad, and I'm a pastor out in Beaverton, actually Aloha, if anybody knows where that is. It's just past Beaverton in the Portland area, and excited to be here with my buddy Ashua, who's with us from Brilliance Labs. Hey, Ashua.
Yeah. What's up, Gabe?
Hey.
Good to be here.
Yeah, it's been a while since we've done this together, but I'm glad to be back here with you. And we get the tremendous privilege of not only being on the Western Seminary campus today, but being here with Todd Miles. And I would love to just hear a little bit from you about background, family, ministry, some of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, sure. Well, the name is Todd Miles. I teach here at Western Seminary. I just finished my 20th year here. I know, it's crazy because I still remember what it was like to walk in here as a student just like 26 years ago, I suppose. I am married. My wife's name is Camille. We have 6 children, 3 of them still at home in their high school years, 3 of them out of the house, a couple married. We have 5 grandchildren already, which is awesome and fun. But I still don't feel like I should be a grandfather.
You still read comic books, and
I do. Yes,
and
nice
kind
call.
of enjoy your.
I do all those things. Yeah. I'm also the pastor of teaching at Gresham Bible Church.
Oh, sweet.
So I get to preach about half the time there.
Wow.
So that's been a lot of fun. I've been there only a matter of months now. Before that, I was at Hinson Church for about 20 years.
Okay.
Yeah. So I guess that's me.
Yeah.
In a nutshell.
And you're an author and podcaster, among other things.
I guess that's true. So I've written a few books. The one I like the most, the one that I'm most proud of, is Superheroes Can't Save You. It's really a book about the person of Christ, where I'm trying to get people who wouldn't ordinarily pick up a Christology to pick it up and read it, because what I do is I compare the heretical ideas of Jesus. I think they're embodied in a lot of comic superheroes, and they make good teaching illustrations. And I think there's a lot of really good theology, very accessible in that book. I have a book based on my dissertation that's theology of religions, the relationship of Christianity to just the idea of religion in particular, universalism, exclusivism, inclusivism, pluralism, that kind of thing. And then my latest book is the one on marijuana. I think is why we're here now. I do a podcast here at the seminary, Food Trucks in Babylon. We try to think about what it's like to live and minister faithfully in a post-Christian context where there's no cultural pressure to be Christian at all.
Right.
And so that's kind of the central theme there. But yeah, that's more of what I do, I suppose.
Man, thanks. It's so good to sit down with you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm looking forward to this.
So I was the one that proposed the idea of talking to you, particularly about this question of cannabis. I'm going to give you just a little bit of my background, and then I'd love to dive a little bit into the book. So I grew up outside of a Christian context on the island of Hawaii, in this small little kind of, you could call it like a jungle kind of ghetto out in the boondocks. And honestly, a lot of my friends' parents and a lot of the context I was in were people growing marijuana. I remember sitting as a kid being in a friend's living room, and the dad is trimming his leaves and buds as we're just hanging out.
Like a bonsai plant or something.
Right.
I remember as I don't know, maybe a 10 or 12-year-old going to a friend's house, and the parents had rolled a joint and were passing it around to the kids because they were too hyper. And it was the way to relax them. So just very much that was the context that I grew up in. And then either very foolishly or maybe in a very kind of wise and contextual way, God called me to plant a church in my hometown. And we named the church Grassroots Church.
Okay.
And literally the first Sunday, we had our launch Sunday, and a group of THC ministers came to find out, hey, are we using the sacrament? Right?
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Oh, wow.
which is code for like, are you guys getting high at the Lord's table? And using the holy anointing oil and the cannabis and all those conversations and like, the burning bush. And we all know what the burning bush was. And so I've had all those conversations deep and like long into the night with these guys that were trying to find a religious excuse for their marijuana habit. And I struggled in ministry in the mid 2000s to talk about it and to create a theological vision. And we would even do like Q&A times and let people talk. Hey, what do you want to talk about? And always across the board, every single time we did that, marijuana was the number one thing people wanted to talk about.
Wow.
And we tried to give a theological vision for it. So to know that like now 15 years later, a theological, like a theology professor has written a robust, practical theology on it it brings joy to my heart. I think it's greatly needed.
I kind of feel like you should have written.
No.
Sounds like it, right?
So, but yeah, for our audience, talk a little bit about the background for the book, what made you get into that, and then some of those main insights and principles that you have.
Yeah. Well, unlike you, I don't have any kind of origin story like that. Mine was very, very practical. When recreational marijuana was legalized in the state of Washington, like the day after, and maybe you guys had these kind of conversations too. We had a person in our congregation. I was serving as an elder at Hinson Church at the time. Someone in the congregation came and asked, "Hey, now that it's legal, or when it's going to be made available?" I mean, so it was like after the election. The
they were waiting. They're ready, jumping on it.
And they said, "Now that's legal. Would it be okay if I went across and consumed, partake, smoked, whatever?" Right? And
can I get your blessing on that?
Yeah. Well, I think they just didn't know, right? Because the pat Christian answer for so long in so many places was, "No, you can't do that because it is illegal." And now it's not illegal anymore. And so how is a Christian supposed to think about this? And so we realized that we actually had a little bit of work to do on that. And so I put down some thoughts, and I went to a pastor's conference that I went to annually, where I spoke on theological and ethical hot topics that pastors should be thinking about. And I remember at the opening, I want to say opening exercises, but that like first plenary session where it's kind of orienting people. And I was just doing a breakout session, and the breakout leaders were supposed to talk about their session to kind of advertise it a little bit. And I said, "Hey, I'm doing my typical hot topics thing, but I thought this year I would do something on the pastor and pot." And like everybody laughed. And up until like 24 hours later, when I actually gave the breakout session, people were coming up to me like, "Hey man, how about the deacon and the doobie? How about Trinity and tree? How about Bible and blunt?" And I thought, man, this is a joke. Is anyone going to show up for this? But when the breakout session started, it was essentially a plenary session. Like everybody was there. It was people standing on the outside, people out outside the door listening in. And so I thought, wow, but I guess people are interested in this. And since then I got invited to churches and men's groups and youth groups and radio and that sort of thing to talk about this, because I guess no one had really thought that much about it. And then I put those ideas down into a book, and that's where Cannabis and the Christian came out of.
So you and Jeff Lacine, right?
Yeah.
Because I remember the Food Trucks in Babylon episode, you guys interviewed him. He had written an article on it, and then all of a sudden he became the expert because it was like literally search for like biblical view of marijuana, and you're like, there's the one article that shows up because someone wrote it.
Yeah, there just wasn't much out there. So then what I found is I went around to churches, and I would get invited for the most part to pretty mainstream conservative evangelical churches. That's usually kind of people have me come in and talk. Is that I pretty much made no one happy with my observations on things, and I remember remember I was at Eugene First Baptist. It's very, conservative Baptist church and old, traditional. And I did the presentation, and all I had was a recreational talk, but people were showing up, and by this, because recreational was legal in Oregon, but so was medical, and people would line up, and it was kind of like there were two lines afterwards, and there was one line of people really angry that I was so critical of marijuana. And then there was another line of people who were angry because I was so liberal when it came to like I wasn't critical enough. I didn't come down hard enough on it. And the pastor who invited me was standing there and kind of running interference. And he kept saying to the people as they said, "You said this, this, and this." And the pastor kept saying, "Todd didn't say that. He didn't say that." And I learned a couple of things there pretty quick. One, I have to have a medical marijuana talk as well. And I also realized that people have pretty strong convictions on this already. And so I need to be as clear and as winsome as I can possibly be, because what I don't want to do is say more than the Bible says. I don't know how you guys feel when you're preaching, but I'm terrified about going beyond what the Bible actually says. I don't want to use the pulpit to bind anyone's conscience in an unbiblical way, right? So what I try to do is provide wisdom and think about it from the perspective of discipleship. I am willing to say that intoxication by marijuana is sinful, because I think it meets all the criteria that we have in the Bible for why the Bible explains why alcohol intoxication is forbidden. It is a sin. I think it hits on really all three of those. You lose, or you have diminished cognitive ability, diminished physical ability, diminished moral judgment. I think marijuana intoxication demonstrably hits all three of those. Now people argue with me about that. And I get it, that's fine. But if you're not cognitively impaired, then okay, I'm not here to tell you what to do, especially if you're not a part of my church, right? But after that, I want to ask wisdom questions. I want to raise the kind of discipleship questions that are raised in the Bible, and give people something very practical when it comes to marijuana, but also hopefully model how a disciple of Christ should think about things that are not explicitly in the Bible. So that's really the goal. If you want to get into more details of what I think or say, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah. I'd be curious to hear your reflection on this one insight that was shared in my church back in the day from an old hippie, right? An older gentleman who had been, you could say, sober and hadn't used in years.
Yeah.
But there'd be different young people talking about, oh yeah, it's not addictive, and there's not this and all this, and then he I just remember he stood up and he says, "You are an amateur pot smoker. You don't know anything about it until you've quit for at least a year."
Oh wow!
And you don't know the control it has over your life until you've stopped for at least a year. And you can always say, "Oh yeah, I'll always quit. I can anytime. Oh yeah, I don't need this. I don't need this. I don't need this. And you just keep going back to it." And so I felt like that was significant, of like, you need to get it behind you for long enough to then in retrospect be able to see this was the control it had in my life.
Yeah, boy, it sounds to me like that's the voice of experience and wisdom right there. There's a lot of misinformation about marijuana. The marijuana lobby is very, very strong, and they have a vested interest in getting as much acceptance as they can of it. But one of the falsehoods, I think it's just a straight falsehood, is that marijuana is not addictive. Now, it is true that marijuana is not as addictive as opioids, for example, or a lot of the other, hard drugs that still in most places, maybe not in Portland, but in most places have a stigma attached to them. Marijuana is not as addictive as nicotine. Marijuana is not as addictive as caffeine, say, but not as addictive doesn't mean not addictive. And if the the evidence is very, very clear. If you're a regular user, someone who uses THC 3 to 4 times a week, about 1 in 10, 1 in 9 adult regular users will develop an addiction. An addiction meaning you've created this artificial dependence upon it that is so strong that you are willing to risk harm to self or others in order to meet that need. Mm-hmm. So it's a serious thing. It's not just, boy, I just kind of feel bad right now. Mm-hmm. If you're a teen regular user, about 1 in 6 teenagers, teenage regular users will develop that kind of addiction. Yeah. So, wow. So I think your friend is right. I've heard that kind of thing a lot also. Not those exact words. I like the language of amateur marijuana user. Yeah. It resonates with what I hear so often from people.
So I wonder if you could do a reality check for maybe some church leaders who are looking out at their congregation and they would say, surely my people are not using marijuana regularly. I would know if they were. Like in the research you've done, how prevalent is it in the wider culture in the Northwest? And do you have any stats on like churchgoers who are also using marijuana? Is it an issue that a pastor should be worried about and talking about, or is it like, oh yeah, my people, that it wouldn't be that?
I don't have any stats for the church. What I have are national stats, and they're pretty alarming. And it's basically over 50% of people use marijuana at least annually. The number goes down to like 40% of all adults use it monthly. It's maybe a quarter of all people use it, of all adults use it regularly, that 3 to 4 times a week. So if you think there aren't people in your congregation who are using, then you're probably fooling yourself, and you don't know your congregation very well. So there's that, and then what skews those stats is it's national, where it includes.
Surely we're not as
it's
bad.
Not legal.
Yeah, surely we're not as bad.
All of the stats for like the prevalence of use in places where it's legal, shockingly, use goes up where it's easily accessible. Teenage use goes up where it's where it's legal and easily accessible.
We're in the area code 50 trees, so
yeah, that's right.
That's right. Yeah. So so good teaching on this, I think, is very important for the church, because especially with the medical use of it. And there are some clear, I think, demonstrative medical benefits to THC and CBD. The cannabis plant, highly complex. I suspect we haven't even scratched the surface of what it can do, because it's been outlawed at the federal level. It's a Schedule I drug still. So it's hard to do medical research.
Which Schedule I means it is harmful, addictive, shouldn't be used, and has no medical
value whatsoever. Yep. So it's really hard to get that research grant for the medical use of something that the federal government says, we know there is no medical benefit to this.
Which might have had something to do with other lobbies and groups that.
That's right. There's a real strange kind of disconcerting history to the legalization or outlawing of marijuana in America. It's got all sorts of nasty overtones and
backroom deals
and maybe some racism and all of that sort of thing is part of the story. I can't even remember what we were talking about. What exactly we were saying.
So, this is kind of touches on what we're saying and transitions to the last point. I'm curious, how do you see it fitting into the discipleship process of a new believer? Should it be a topic that is broached with, let's say, a young person that is just starting to come to church? They've just come to faith. Maybe they met Christ at a campus ministry. They're visiting your church. Where does this fit in within that discipleship process?
Yeah, that's a great question. I remember what I was going to say before, so let me hit that. So because the medical use is out there, and doctors are, it's hard for doctors to prescribe marijuana. You can prescribe THC.
Oh, I know internet doctors that'll do it.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah. But I mean, it's really hard to control dosage, right? Of marijuana. I mean, what do they say? Smoke 2 joints, call me in the morning. That doesn't really work very well because people's reaction to THC is so varied. It's not really certainly as predictable as with alcohol. And so doctors, friends, especially people struggling with chronic pain, it'll be recommended it's going to be recommended to people in your churches. And so I can't tell you how many emails I've gotten from people saying, hey, this was recommended. What do you think? I don't know how to think about this. There's still here's one of the maybe the bright spots to marijuana legalization, medical marijuana legalization, is there's still a stigma attached to marijuana use for a lot of people. And so even when it's recommended, even by a doctor, they're saying, man, is this right? Should I do this?
And you're not just talking about people that call themselves Christians.
No. Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe we should have been thinking that way about all drugs. I mean, we're in the middle of an opioid addiction epidemic right now. And most of the people who are addicted to opioids weren't out there looking for a high, scrounging around. They probably were prescribed it for chronic pain issues. And now they find themselves hooked, and it's made a hash of their life. It's even killing them in many cases. So maybe we should have been thinking from a Christian perspective about all drugs. And that's not to say yes or no to them, but just is this right? Is this good? And so that's some of the questions there. Okay, the new believer question. Yeah. I think it's vital to think about because this may come as a surprise to a new believer, but hopefully it's a pleasant surprise. God cares about you passionately. Every single aspect of who you are, what you do, what you say, what you think, what you put into your body, all of that, Jesus Christ claims lordship over. And of course, hopefully you realize that Jesus is not a vile taskmaster whose goal in life is to suck the joy out of your experiences. No, he has come to give you life, abundant, eternal life. He loves you more than you can possibly imagine. He cares about you passionately, and any rule, if you will, any curbing of behavior, anything where he might say, no, don't do that. It's motivated by a deep knowledge of you and a deep love for you. And so, trying to discern the will of God is in our best interest in every conceivable way. And so I guess that's why I would think, like, for a new believer, you might want to think well on this, because the Bible, I do believe the Bible is sufficient. It's not exhaustive. It doesn't tell us everything about everything, thankfully. I mean, who could lug that Bible around?
No
right?
kidding.
But it is sufficient. We have all the divine words that we need. Maybe not all that we might want, but all the divine words we need in order to live faithfully before him. And so the question is, how do I take what the Bible tells us explicitly and then apply that to things where the Bible's silent? And it could be that you have total freedom to do that. It could be that you have some freedom to do some things, right? It just depends on who's watching, the audience, your place in your situation in life, that kind of thing. Or it could be that even though the Bible doesn't explicitly say don't do it, you really ought not to do it. So anyway, those are a few things that come to mind.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're saying you're setting a theological vision early on. Hey, God's the commands and God cares about your whole being, and his words to you are for your good.
Yes.
So you lay that framework. But even practically, how does this come up in conversation? Should pastors or discipleship leaders, small group leaders be assuming, hey, this is if I have a list of discipleship areas, this needs to be on the list and we need to have this conversation. And then how do you like put it next to, okay, so you're living with your girlfriend, or you're dealing with things you're doing on the internet, and then you smoke marijuana with your friends. Like where do you fit that into that all those conversations?
Yeah. Like doing some sort of triage on a person's.
Yeah. Is it a Bible study? Is it a list? Is it like, practically how you do that?
Well, yeah, I think that's I'd be interested in what you think about that as well. And here's just some thoughts. I'm just kind of thinking out loud at this point. So we've talked a little bit about the doctrine of revelation, about the sufficiency of Scripture. We've talked a little bit about God's love and care for us. I think a good anthropology would fit into that as well, that God created us good, that he gave us dominion over this material world, that the stuff that God has made is good and is a generous gift from a very good God, what he's made. And I would put cannabis in that as well, right? I don't, some people think that cannabis comes about because of the weeds that are, the curse of Adam, the thorns, right? The thorns and thistles and weeds and that kind of thing. No, I don't think so. I think cannabis was around pre-fall and post-fall. And so therefore it's good. Does that mean that I can do whatever I want with it? Well, no, I think like arsenic is a generous gift of a benevolent God, but that doesn't mean I'm going to ingest it, right? There's appropriate ways to use God's good gifts, and that's going to take wisdom and discernment. I would think about who we are as material beings as well. That there's a material part of us and an immaterial part, and what we do with the material part of us affects the immaterial. We know that if you're a parent of a toddler, you know that when they get physically tired, they get a bit selfish and sinful, right? But so do we actually. We just are more civilized in how we complain. But the immaterial part of us also affects the material. That's just how God created us. And so what we do with stuff and what we put into our bodies, it is part of the lordship of Jesus. It's part of how we walk before him. Where we put that on the list of sins, boy, what I would never say is, hey, like the key to being saved is giving up pot, right? I would never say that. I would say though that when you come to Christ, you need to recognize, and it's going to take time, and he's going to reveal parts of your life that you haven't given over to him, and I can just say from experience, I'm 56 years old. I can't remember a time where I didn't believe in Christ. I grew up in a Christian home. My testimony is the kind of testimony every Christian parent wants for their children, right? But I can honestly say I have never regretted one time, not once ever, being obedient. I have never regretted one time ever giving up something for Christ. Now, there have been times where I've given something up and realized I didn't actually have to give that up. But wisdom, that's the way with wisdom and freedom in Christ and our consciences. And so, where does that land in the list of sins? Well, I mean, all sin separates us from God, but not all sins are equal. There are a lot of sins that have more devastating repercussions in life. There are sins that demonstrate probably a more hardness toward God. And so I would encourage any young believer, any older believer as well, come to Christ with an open hand and let him do in your life what he wants to do. You won't regret it. You won't regret it.
Yeah. I love that.
That's so good.
Yeah. It seems to me like what you're saying is there's really nothing off the table when it comes to discipleship. It's everything, right?
Yeah.
And so it's nice that we don't have to be like, compartmentalizing all these conversations necessarily. It's just the overall stewardship of what God has granted us and how we're surrendering that to him over time.
Yes. And so like the kind of wisdom questions that I ask is for recreational use, say, and there's overlap between the medical use. I think there's two different questions. Something I should say, for a lot of people don't realize, it's kind of strange, but they don't realize that medical marijuana is the same as recreational marijuana.
Just different label.
Yeah, but you go into a dispensary, it's not even labeled differently, right? It's the same. It's the same substance, right? But what's different is probably the motivation.
Yep.
And I would also say that a lot of people are recreational users. They're really using it medically. They're trying to, they're using marijuana to cope with something. Maybe it's their anxiety. Maybe it's their, timidity. Maybe it's their ADHD that hasn't been diagnosed, but they find that they just think more clearly, or they think they think more clearly this way, right? So anyway, the kind of wisdom questions that I would ask are: is THC going to better enable you to use your gifts to serve others in the church? Is THC going to deepen your relationship with the Lord? Is THC the kind of thing that you can use with a clear conscience? Is THC the kind of thing that you can thank the Lord for as you are using? These are all the kind of questions that we should ask about anything that's not explicitly in the Bible. That there's a term in theology that we use, adiaphora, like gray areas, and the Bible addresses gray areas. Where it's a matter of conscience. Whatever is not done in faith is sin. That you can have two people who are engaged in the same exact behavior, but for one person it is sinful, and for another it's not. And now that doesn't necessarily mean that just because it's not in the Bible, that doesn't mean it's a gray area. And like I said, I'm pretty willing to make a case. Nah, intoxication is sinful. Recreational intoxication is sinful. And then the question that I get a lot is, well, can I use without being intoxicated?
That line is really hard to find.
I suppose it is. It's much harder than with alcohol, for example, right? And
today's marijuana is not your grandma's marijuana. It's entirely different.
I've read like the numbers from like the 60s and 70s, where maybe like 3% THC. Boy, you can walk into a dispensary and get oils that are like 90.
Oh wow!
So it's that. Yeah. And that's so breeders, if that's what you call the people who are they are cultivating marijuana for higher THC levels or higher CBD levels. And interestingly, those are usually inversely proportional. The higher the THC level, the lower the CBD level.
Yeah. So one last, just potentially short question. I'm curious. So like when I was in Hawaii, one of the areas, like it was with marijuana, there was the religious kind of bringing together. Some of it was Rastafarianism, more shamanism, and a lot of entheogenic religions that use marijuana, that use different substances, ayahuasca and all these things to contact the divine or the spiritual. And I'm just curious, have you done some study into that with your world religion studies? Yeah. And should someone who thinks I'm just using this substance because I like how it makes me feel, are there perhaps spiritual things going on or spiritual things that they're opening themselves to that they're just not thinking about, but is actually happening?
Yeah. And it almost sounds like there's two different things going on there. Like if you're taking it physically and are not aware spiritually, then you're not really thinking of it as an entheogen, right? Because so the definition of an entheogen is like some sort of substance, mind altering usually, that's supposed to unlock spiritual planes and that kind of thing. So I would say absolutely, our anthropology tells us that the material affects the immaterial affects the material parts, but that's just how we were made. We're these integrated unities. Now, have I done any study on entheogens? Yes. For the world religions part, no, I hadn't. I hadn't even heard that term until I started doing the marijuana research. For a long time, not quite as prevalent now, which I think probably betrays some of the motivation.
It was just legal. It was all about getting I have a religious license to use this and sell it. Yeah, I know a guy.
There you go. There you go. So the cynical part of me thinks that these so-called cannabis churches were just a way to get cannabis into the hands of people. But there are cannabis churches where you use cannabis. What you were talking about before, it's so fun for me to hear you say that, because I run into that often. Most people don't.
Well, it's huge. Like if for young men that listen to like the Joe Rogan podcast, he talks a lot about entheogenic things and how they use these substances, and it's a part of their spiritual mind expanding kind of pursuit of whatever it means to be.
So I did, part of my research is I subscribed to a cannabis church that would lead people on weekly devotionals. And
that must have been fascinating.
It was strange for someone like me. It's like that you should have written this book, to where I'm watching over Zoom, which is because it was this, I wrote the book, I think during the COVID lockdown. I'm watching over Zoom, and the instructor would come in, and there'd be all this kind of psychedelic stuff, lighting and flashing and that sort of thing. And the instructor or the guide would assume the lotus position and do some mind exercises or some relaxation exercises, and then would instruct the people to light up and partake. And then more lights and strange things, and then a series of questions that none of which were distinctly Christian in any way. It seemed to have far more in common in my experience with like an Eastern mysticism than with anything confessionally Christian at all. I would just say this. I haven't given any short answers yet, have I?
No, that's right.
That from a biblical perspective, I just don't see a place for an entheogen. They're just not there. Now, maybe there's like one verse in the Psalms that wine gladdens the heart. Okay. But after that, the illustration that I often use is like meditation, a strong biblical value, right? A practice, not just a value, a practice that deepens our relationship with the Lord. But biblical meditation, the Hebrew word is hagah, and it literally means like to mutter over, like to think so hard about something that your lips begin to move, right? If you found yourself like reading out loud something that isn't coming to you quickly, that's what biblical meditation is. It's like, it's the exact opposite of like Eastern meditation, where you're emptying your mind. Biblical meditation is you are wrestling hard with God's word, and you're. I was friends with David Needham. We were at the same church for a long time.
Oh wow! And he was one of my faves,
which makes you like everybody who went to Multnomah, right? Yeah.
Oh yeah,
amazing, godly man, and such a good teacher. But he talked about biblical meditation like sucking on a lemon drop,
right?
Where you're just working it over in your mouth, trying to get every ounce of flavor out of it. Well, that's what biblical meditation is. You're thinking hard about something. That's more of a biblical practice, not introducing a mind-altering chemical that allows you or to reach some sort of higher spiritual plane. Jesus, he wants you to take every thought captive in obedience to him. Jesus wants your mind as well, right? We are to love the Lord with our strength, our soul, our mind. The Old Testament text, the New Testament text, there's no one exhaustive list. It's pretty much exemplary lists that say, God says, I want every part of you. Every part of you. And so I just don't see where an entheogen fits in. The testimony that I hear from a lot of people who say that cannabis changed my life, and it changed my life spiritually as well. Many people experience like chronic pain, and they find that they have some relief from cannabis use. And doctors and researchers are all over the board on whether there actually is that cannabis works for pain. But in many people's experience, it does. And I don't want to argue with that. But it seems like what happens is that my experience with like watching my wife when she had cancer and was doing chemotherapy and surgery and all that, I discovered watching her that pain is mind altering. Pain is mind altering. And so what happens though is that when people find some relief from that, then they can begin to almost think clearly for change. Pain itself, it's mind altering. It clutters our mind. We like all of the discipleship questions that I ask about using your gifts and being able to make a defense and all these things, those are out the window for people who are, like when my wife was on chemotherapy and was like so horrifically sick. So I think the so-called spiritual benefit to marijuana is more, it seems to me, I could be wrong on this, but it seems to me that people are experiencing some relief from pain that has crippled them and has altered their minds for so long that they're actually able to open up their Bibles and pray with a clear mind, a semi-clear mind at least. Yeah. But I don't think that's an entheogen at that point. I just can't find anything in the Bible where we're supposed to take a mind-altering substance. I probably should have just said that. Probably good.
Okay, I want to press in a little bit on these gray areas. And my own personal story is probably a little bit more like yours, Todd, where, I wasn't really exposed to a lot of this stuff, growing up and that. And then being a pastor for a long time now in the Portland area, one of the things that I'm kind of wondering about is, you've got these gray areas, but there's also context. And if you look in scripture, one of the things that I'm always fascinated with is like when, for instance, the Apostle Paul will press into an issue that almost seems like this is an absolute, but then in a different area, he might have a different answer. And it might be geographical, in some ways, right? Like maybe you think about gender roles or you think about some of those kinds of things. I wonder if in our area, in the Portland area, back in the dawn of the craft beer era, was that the same conversation that we're having right now? And if so, then does context, the fact you mentioned we're having an opioid crisis. So does context make this conversation more important here than it might be somewhere else?
Yes. I think that if you are in a culture like in Portland, there's like the green crosses everywhere, right? They're ubiquitous. I don't even know how these places stay in business because they're so heavily taxed, and they don't sell anything else really, right? So context is vital to people, to pastors who are in areas where medical and recreational are still illegal. This might not be quite as urgent of a topic, but it's coming. It's coming for sure. For here though, it's so commonplace. I have a friend who was given a gift from an appreciative family for a service that was rendered of sorts. And the gift was a plate of brownies and said, hey, these on the left, don't let your kids, there's something special in there for you there. And so that's how common it is. And a known Christian was on the receiving end of this. So yeah, these kind of questions are going to come up in our culture. It's just everywhere, right? I do think that the context matters. We need to be training our people, the people that God has put under us, how to think biblically, how to honor the Lord with whatever we see is coming down the road. I mean, that's part of being a shepherd, having that provision, if you will, to be able to see ahead. We're not, at least I'm not. I don't have that kind of gift where I can do it with prophetic clarity. But when there's something this obvious, we need to be training people for that here. And I mean, even in Portland, we just legalized mushrooms, right? And
is that going to be the next conversation?
Well, it probably is. It's so transparently strange though, because what's the benefit of it? It just allows you to kind of check out in really tough situations, because you to have to live in your moment, whether it's like a terminal illness or something like that, is just so overwhelming that it's better to be able to use this. I mean, it's not curing anything, at least that I know of. So that could be, that one seems like the whole goal of it is to be in a mind altered state. So what do you think? If we've talked a little bit about the discipleship of a new believer as an example, it should include discernment on gray issues and I love some of the questions that you've thrown out. I think those are really great. What about when it comes to leaders, church leaders? How prevalent do you think this is among church leaders? How should we be thinking about and talking about that? Well, the bar is raised a little for church leaders. The qualification for elders are, as you know, they're remarkably unremarkable. They're like, wow, so what you really want is a mature Christian.
Yeah.
That's what you want. That should be everybody's goal, right? But that's the bar. They need to have a good reputation. And so there could be questions about that. You need to be above reproach.
I guess I'm asking because, in a city like ours, and we're doing this podcast because we recognize that, one, we all want to have a better handle on how to do gospel multiplication ministry in this kind of context, but also we realize there's a lot of times there's people coming in from the outside and sort of just flying blind, and so hoping to put some resources in people's hands. But if you're here and you're like, man, we're starting a church or we're trying to rebuild a church, and where's the leaders? Okay, there's somebody who's breathing there,
Yeah.
How do we think about this kind of stuff when it comes to this issue?
Well, I guess my general answer to that's not related to the marijuana issue is don't compromise the biblical qualifications. It's probably better to go without elders than to put an unqualified person in there. I think there's something to be said in our culture. There might be a good reason to have someone who says, you know what, I may have the freedom to partake, but because of the church that I'm at and the people that I'm going to be ministering with, I just can't do that. And that might be a stance with alcohol as well. I think there's more freedom to use alcohol than what we probably have with cannabis. It's really, as you said, it's really hard. That line between intoxication and non-intoxication, alcohol is just very different in that regard. But there's certainly contexts where, like, I don't drink really. All the alcohol I've had in my life has really been at religious functions, and that's because of my background with my mom and my dad. That there was a lot of alcoholism in the family. My mom was like the stereotype of a child of an alcoholic. So that's what I grew up with. I see alcohol as a good gift from a generous Lord, just not one that I partake in. I don't really like the taste of it. There are some churches who it might be good for your leaders to say, because of our congregation, the things that our congregation struggles with, I'm not going to use alcohol. There might be other congregations where people are coming from a more legalistic place, where you might not make that choice in your leaders. It might be good to have to be very explicit. We're not going to be legalistic about this. It's always good to say we're not going to be legalistic, but we're going to be explicit about it at this point. And with marijuana, I really try not to do things in the black and white, but I don't think anybody's going to read my book and be encouraged to use marijuana. But what I hope is I give sufficient wisdom that people can make good choices, that they can. I mean, especially even from a medical perspective, I do have a series of questions that there's overlap with the recreational questions, but I think that we ought to be asking ourselves when we use marijuana medically.
Okay. Yeah.
I didn't answer your question.
No, yeah. Well, I mean, I think what I hear you saying is we've got to be super thoughtful about the way we handle leadership conversations. That sometimes are going to have checklists and sometimes are not. And maybe the context does actually inform that a little bit.
I think it probably would. I would be hard pressed to say to a person, yeah, hey, I think you guys that like recreational marijuana use should be something that your leadership is known for.
Whereas if you back it down to beer or wine, that might be a different conversation.
It could be.
Yeah.
And isn't there a biblical precedent from the life of Paul where he willfully gives up his freedoms for the sake of his ministry, right? Yes. And so to be able to say in this context, and we did this in Hawaii where marijuana is everywhere. We literally had a box truck medical dispensary with a doctor that was ready to write you a prescription 20 feet from our church door every Sunday at the farmer's market there. So like that was the context.
Not that you hired.
No. It was there in the farmer's market. No. We didn't put it there. Yeah. But like, so we made that decision. It was just clear among the leadership team. This is we agree that we will not be users of this substance because of the context we're in.
Which is kind of similar probably to our context here really now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you could be right about that. I think that's great wisdom from the Apostle Paul, who's willing to give up something that he knows he has the freedom. And I think that's the issue. It would be wrong for him to engage in something that he didn't think he had the freedom for, because then he would be violating his conscience. That's clearly sinful and dangerous. You should never violate your conscience. But that is the model that we see, right? A Christian who is so enamored of Christ, who's so given over to Christ that he's willing to give up small things in pursuit of helping other people pursue the Christ and experience his majesty. I think that's a good model right there.
So that kind of leads to my personal last question for you, which is how do you see this issue, or maybe give us some instruction here on how can we as the church create more credibility with the outside non-believing world when it comes to this issue?
Yeah. Well, I think for one thing, don't say more than the Bible says, and frame this, even if you come to the conclusion, like I do, that probably recreational marijuana, no. Intoxication, absolutely not. Medical marijuana, hey, there's some questions that you probably should be asking. There could be some real good benefit to it. But know enough about the issue that you can speak faithfully and credibly on it. Saying things like marijuana is, like the devil's lettuce or something like that.
Reefer madness.
Reefer madness. A movie from the past, right? That was tacky and campy and discredited because it's so lousy. And for people who are part of the marijuana culture, if you come off sounding crazy, they'll just say, well, that's just reefer madness. That's their way of saying you have no credibility whatsoever. Well, we want to have credibility while maintaining our biblical fidelity. Yeah. Right. And so that's going to mean that or require that we know something about marijuana. You're going to have to do some homework. Hopefully I give enough information about what cannabis is, how THC works, how it affects us, how CBD works, how it affects us, that sort of thing, to where you can actually make good judgments and sound credible when you're talking about marijuana. But then also be faithful at the same time. So be faithful and be credible is I think what we need. If we go off half cocked, if we sound absolutely legalistic, where we are binding people's consciences to match our sensibilities that we have baptized with no biblical foundation for it at all, then we're actually sinning at that point. It's like spiritual abuse, I would argue. And hopefully that's not something we want to be a part of, right? We want to avoid that as much as we can.
Thank you. Those are great words. Okay, one more time, the name of the book.
Cannabis and the Christian, all that the Bible says about marijuana, or something like that.
Okay.
And there's actually something in there. You might think it's a gag book, like everything men know about women. You open it up and there's nothing in it, right? There actually is some printed words in there.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And then also, if somebody wants to get a hold of you and just kind of take this conversation to the next place, where would they get a hold of you?
Yeah, the easiest way is over email, tmiles@westernseminary.edu. You can Google my name, and it'll come up.
Okay.
Either with the podcast or preaching here or there, or my place in seminary. But Miles at westernseminary.edu.
Okay. Hey, thanks so much for being with us and just sharing your insights.
Sure,
Appreciate you. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Jesus in the Upper Left. We want to ask you a quick favor. Would you please subscribe so you don't miss a single episode, and share with those that are in your life that might benefit from the content. Hit the notifications button, rate and review, of course, and then head on over to upperleftshow.com where you can find bonus content, opportunities to connect with those around the city that are doing similar work as you, resources to help you, and just a way to connect to the community. We hope to see you again next time.